Thank you very much. I think that was a very good, if you like, explanation of the basic way in which the Dáil works, and a proper acknowledgement that in fact some of the caricatures that nothing has changed is actually not true. There's been quite a number of changes. There may be a debate as to how effectively some of these changes work, but it should be acknowledged that there are a lot of changes, and changes for the right reasons. We have about 10 minutes now to a dialogue with Muris, and as I said last night at the masterclass, there is actually no such thing as a stupid question here. I mean, if there are basic issues that people want to ask about, please don't be shy about asking. So, over to you. Yeah, Catherine. And again, could we just to restate? We as we have right through, people standing up and asking questions will state their names.
Just to take up on a point that Muris raised, one of the last points he made in relation to the Seanad, and I suppose as a senator it's something that I'm interested in, but it does seem somewhat absurd to have a debate about political reform, especially in the context of the recent referendum, without actually discussing Seanad reform. So I think that's something that probably needs to be said, although there's probably little we can do about it, because I don't think it's going to be on the agenda. Just with regard to reform generally, language is obviously the most important thing that comes out of politicians. But I have a particular bugbear about dress code, and I personally believe that if a person were to turn up in a bank as an employee, the way that some of our parliamentarians choose to turn up, that they might be at risk of losing their jobs. And I just wondered if you had any ideas around that. I personally believe as well that the more deal that is made of it, probably the less effective, enforcement would actually be. But just if you had any ideas in and around that, I'd be very interested. And then just on the EU, I wonder how we can improve. I know you say that there have been improvements, but I don't think that they have been good enough. And you mentioned the media and the EU, and with the greatest respect to the media really aren't that interested in reporting on the EU and what happens there. And so many of our laws are dictated from Europe now. I think it's very important that we have more engagement with the EU. So I just wondered in particular about that, if you had any practical ideas. I think in a way you have to be careful what you wish for there as well, because there's such a volume of law coming from the EU that to scrutinise every piece for the sake of it would be foolhardy as well. But I was just interested in hearing more about that as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Could we maybe take a couple of comments or questions before going back to Muris? Alban, please, and then Tom.
Thank you very much, Alban McGuinness, SDLP Northern Ireland Assembly. Just one aspect of reform that could be considered, and that is the way in which the Northern Ireland Assembly has its committee system. I think it is a preferable system to either the system at Westminster or the system in Dáil Éireann. The potentially anyway, and they haven't reached their potential as yet, but potentially the Northern Ireland committees are much more powerful than any committee system that I have seen, perhaps outside the United States. Can initiate inquiries, it can initiate legislation, which is at the very centre of the function of any parliamentary democracy. So I would like some little aside, as it were, in relation to how that could actually benefit Dáil Éireann. The final point I just want to make by way of comment in relation to this debate, until you have a looser discipline within your parliamentary system, in particular in Dáil Éireann, until the whip system is more relaxed, I don't think you're going to get the sort of freedom that many people are looking for, that the legislator, him or herself, is actually inputting rather than the party inputting. And I think we really have to look at that system of political discipline, whip control within Dáil Éireann. And I think that's an area that we really have to look at in depth. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Francis, and then we'll go to Tom after
Francis Fitzgerald. Thank you for your presentation, Muris. I'm glad you made the point at the beginning that comments are often made in a kind of stereotype way about the Dáil as if there had been no change. And clearly there has been some, but there's scope for a lot more. And I suppose very often the Dáil is interpreted through what's seen on the order of business, on media reports. And there is an awful lot of other things, as you've pointed out, happening. But having said that, what I wanted to ask you was, what parliaments do you admire in terms of the balance? You've looked at parliaments around the world. So where do you believe that the balance is actually working effectively? That'd be one question I'd have. And linked to that, is there any correlation between that and gender balance in parliaments in terms of reform? Because clearly in Ireland, our gender balance in Parliament is very poor. So I'd be really interested, where do you see parliaments that typify, obviously more power to the executive is one of the issues, and then parliamentary balance. So who's getting it more correct as in this century as we move on?
Okay, thanks, Francis. Tom, and then we'll go back to Muris after these 4 questions.
Tom Burke. Just on the question of oversight of the executive, I recognise that we need some sort of a discipline in the House, but the whip system as it operates in Dáil Éireann essentially circumvents the constitutional requirement that the government is answerable to the Dáil. How can that be balanced out? And the second issue, if I understand it correctly, you have to have a minimum number of independent TDs grouping to form a technical group and have speaking rights. Now, if after the next election we revert to the more traditional 1 or 2 independents, they will not have speaking rights, and is that not taking away from the democratic rights of the voters that elected them? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. There's an interesting mix of questions there, Muris, so maybe you'll attempt to address them. Thank you.
Yep. John, do you mind? I might stand up because I think better on my feet than if I sit there. Generally, as a rule. The first question, yeah, I think, okay, I don't want to drag the convention too much into the area of Seanad reform, but of course you're absolutely right, and I think in the context of the referendum, we sort of really need to rethink the Oireachtas, that we've never really in Ireland, this is my own view of this, is we've never really seen ourselves as a bicameral parliamentary system with 2 legislatures doing 2 things and performing really, really well in that regard. And I think you're right. I think there needs to be some sort of a rethink now, a very substantial rethink. What is the role of Seanad Éireann going to be? What usefully can it do? How can it quite drastically improve its performance? And no disrespect to the senators and so on that are there at the moment, but you've seen the evolution. I'm particularly interested in the sort of the changing role of parliamentarians in Dáil Éireann. I think senators themselves, what they do is going to have to be looked at as well. I mean, it wasn't that long ago. Again, you sort of tend to forget these things. I was just looking in 2002. 102 TDs were also local councillors and 27 senators. I mean, we forget this. That's 10 years ago, just slightly more, and like that has changed. Okay, so a gradual changing in what we mean by Parliament in Ireland. That we the referendum's over. It's been decided. The Senate's here to stay. Right. Let's have a genuinely bicameral parliamentary system, and with very substantial roles, very high performing Houses of Parliament. In terms of the dress code, yeah, this is really tricky. I can really see the 2 sides to this argument. It's not just in the recent election. This again goes back to 2002. The Committee on Procedure and Privileges was called to make a report on it, and at that time, if I recall, they were quite strongly of the view that suits and ties should be worn, but they seem to take an alternative view, I think, more recently. But I don't know. I don't know the answer to that one. On the one hand, of course, this is meant to be the premier institution of the state, and people should, dress accordingly. But then members, are elected as individual democratic representatives, and should we get too carried away with what they wear? Maybe not. So, sorry, I'll have to plead the Fifth Amendment on that one. The EU media dimension. Yeah, this is again the European Union dimension. It's often thrown out there that parliaments generally are completely incapable of dealing with the EU. There have been quite a lot of changes. There's quite a lot of movement going on. The European Movement Ireland did a very nice report 3 or 4 years ago, and they looked in tremendous detail at where legislation and issues coming before the House of Oireachtas, how much of it emanated from Europe. And if I recall, they said it's actually more like between 15 and 20%, not the 80 to 90% you often hear about. So it's surprisingly, it's not as big a deal. It is a big deal, but it's the quantity of stuff emanating from Europe isn't as much. There have been changes. I mean, there's a more general challenge for parliaments in the context of the European project and the sort of joint efforts of parliaments to have a voice at European level. And you know, there's these yellow cards and orange cards and so on, and where parliaments are meant to be able to object to European legislation. But it's very hard for parliaments to do that. Parliaments don't have singular voices, as we keep saying. You know, it's a collection of members. Governments are more cohesive. Intergovernmentalism is much stronger than interparliamentarism. Okay, so it's quite difficult to do. So I think, sorry, your question was about how could things improve. I can't give you a very easy answer to that, other than to keep trying to improve in the sense of more resources. The European Affairs Committee, the Scrutiny Committee, just getting better at what it does. I think the fact that the Oireachtas has a full-time member of staff in Brussels is quite significant. The parties, the parliamentary parties, obviously have their own MEPs and connections in Europe as well. No parliament has really resolved this. I mean, it's very common to hear criticisms in other countries of the way they deal with European Union membership and how they deal with that. Just turning to Alban McGuinness's question there about the Assembly, yeah, I'm familiar with this. The potential, funnily enough, the potential powers of the Oireachtas committees are quite strong as well, but it's the issue of utilising them, as you say, particularly in respect of initiating legislation. What's very interesting is the work being done in the Assembly in respect of scrutiny, helping members to be better scrutinisers of the executive. I think that's very, very interesting work that's going on there, and there's a lot to be said for that. I know it's supported by various means, but yeah, I think there's a lot of the recent North-South interparliamentary cooperation. I think there's a lot to be learned to either side of the border there for the different systems. Minister Fitzgerald then, which parliament I admire? Yeah, I might. I mean, I think, I know Meg Russell is here, not to put pressure on her, but I think there will be quite a bit of discussion about this later. I mean, I'm nearly reluctant to say it because we always go, well, the Nordic countries for absolutely everything, they're just amazing. And then you talk to people from them, they say, oh no, we're racked with problems, nothing works here. You know, it's like every country struggles with these problems. I would pick Norway because I think it's one of the highest in terms of the gender quote, I think, but there's been a general feminisation of everything in Norway. Like they do these public service censuses there, and there's been a huge increase in the number of women working generally in the Norwegian public service. And the report, I can't remember, there are consequences to that, but I can't remember what they were. But if you don't mind, there's genuinely people at the back of the room who are better qualified than me to speak at the moment about which parliament is better. I mean, there is this issue too. You tend to look around and go, well, aren't they amazing? But like, I mean, the House of the Oireachtas, there's a lot to be said for, you know, focusing on it, and it is distinctive. You know, you can't sort of copy another parliament because things don't transfer as easily. So I think, you know, we've a fairly good idea about what needs to be done in the Oireachtas, and starting there would be good. And finally there, Tom, oversight of the executive. The whip system, yeah, I mean, this was played out a lot recently in the media. The whip system is technically a voluntary arrangement, and I mean, the more benevolent view of it is that it allows for things to happen, okay? That you have 166 members. If we just had a free-for-all, nothing would happen. You have to arrange yourself, you have to have parties, the whip system, that's the way it works. However, it seems to go too far. And I wonder, and this is a question for the convention, is it possible to change the standing orders to protect the rights of individual members against the kind of, what would you call it, the tyranny of the whip, as it were? So to encourage members to sort of to do things that maybe departs from their parties, doesn't challenge their party fundamentally, but allows them to do things without having to go through their parliamentary party grouping to do it. And this relates to the issue you're saying of the technical rights for independence. Now, if we're to believe a lot of the current literature that there is going to be more and more independence in politics generally, this does have a knock-on impact, because you're right, the rules, the standing orders do give a bias towards parliamentary party groupings. And it came up a number of years ago, I think, when there was slightly more independent members than a member of think it was the Labour Party, I can't remember at the time, but there had to be some change to the technical, to the rules, the standing orders for technical groups. So that relates. So I think it's almost, if this is true that there's going to be more independent members, the standing orders are going to have to change to reflect the rights of those members individually. So,
okay.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Muris. Excellent. Okay.